For 8 long years, Tobias Redmond had lived in the echo of silence. His only conversations were with the horses in the barn and the wind that whistled through the canyons. His heart, once warm with laughter and love, had hardened into stone after the day he buried both his wife and daughter beneath the weeping cottonwoods. Since then, his world had become small, a cabin, a fence, and an unyielding solitude that kept the pain at bay. On that stormy night, nature itself seemed to mourn. Rain lashed against the wooden shutters like fists demanding to be heard. Thunder rolled through the hills with the sound of distant cannons, and lightning painted the sky with fractured light. It was a night that promised no peace. Tobias sat by the fireplace, working silently on a worn bridle that had served better days. His fingers moved from memory, calloused hands guided by muscle rather than thought. The fire crackled, the only warmth in a room otherwise filled with ghosts. That's when the knocking started. Not a gentle knock, not the neighborly greeting of a passing traveler. This knock was wild, desperate, like someone on the edge of life and death. Tobias froze, his needle held midair. No one came to his ranch. Not anymore. He'd made sure of that. The knock came again, harder, followed by urgent voices in a language Tobias recognized from a time he'd tried to forget. Apache. His heart clenched. The last time he'd heard that language outside his dreams. It had been the night strangers came to his door, and the morning after. He had buried everything he loved. His eyes moved instinctively to the rifle above the mantel. The weight of it was familiar, comforting, terrifying, but something held him back. The voices weren't the battle cries of raiders or threats shouted in anger. They were pleading, frantic whispers carried on the wind, full of sorrow rather than fury. He stepped toward the heavy oak door, each footfall slow, deliberate. Behind the thick wood, the voices grew clearer, women, speaking in hurried tones. One voice rose above the rest. "Please, we know you are there. We need shelter just for tonight." 8 years of solitude had sharpened Tobias's instincts. Every part of him screamed that opening that door could be the end of him. But another part, quieter, older, whispered that maybe it was time. Maybe kindness still had a place in a heart that had been numb for too long. He pressed his palm against the wood. It vibrated softly with the cadence of the voices. He remembered how Sarah used to say that kindness wasn't weakness, it was what separated them from the beasts. But Sarah was gone, and with her, that kindness had been buried too. Then came the words that would change everything. "They are coming. If you do not help us, we will die out here. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die, too." Tobias's hand hovered over the iron bar securing the door. 8 years. He had never opened it for anyone. But the sound of that woman's voice cut through the fear and rust like sunlight breaking through a storm. With effort that seemed to reach into his bones, Tobias lifted the bar. The door creaked open, slowly, revealing a scene that would remain etched in his soul forever. 10 Apache women stood huddled against the wind and rain. Their dresses were torn, their feet bare and muddied. Blood mixed with rainwater stained their clothes and skin. The youngest among them couldn't have been older than 16. And she clutched a bundle wrapped in cloth, a baby, barely breathing in the cold. The oldest bore silver in her hair and eyes that had seen too many funerals. But it was the woman who had spoken who held his gaze. She stood apart from the others. Her chin lifted despite the exhaustion painting shadows on her face. Blood streaked from a cut above her eye. Her dress torn at the shoulder. But her eyes, deep, dark, resolute, met his without flinching. "I am Ayana," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days." Tobias opened his mouth, then closed it. He had questions. Hundreds of them. Where they came from. Who was chasing them. Why they were alone. But then he saw the baby's lips, blue from the cold. Motionless except for the tiniest flicker of breath. Some things mattered more than questions. "Come in," he heard himself say. They moved quickly, shadows disappearing into the warmth of his cabin. Tobias felt the space close in around them. For so long, it had been his refuge from grief. Now it was filled with the sounds of breathing, of quiet sobs, of whispered reassurances between women who had lost more than they would ever say. Ayana was the last to enter. As she passed, she whispered, "The soldiers hunting us. Maybe an hour behind. Maybe less. They will not stop until every one of us is dead." Tobias slid the iron bar back into place, knowing it would not hold back what was coming. But he had made a choice. And in that choice, something inside him began to shift. "Why?" he asked her. "Why are they hunting you?" She looked up at him. And in her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own past, grief, injustice, and the will to survive. "Because we chose to live," she said, "when they expected us to die quietly." Tobias felt something stir in his chest. Not anger, not fear, hope. Because for the first time in 8 years, he wasn't alone in the storm. Blank. Blank. The rain had not let up. It wept from the sky like the earth itself mourned, drenching the plains and blurring the lines between past and present. Inside Tobias Redmont's cabin, the storm was muffled, but not forgotten. The logs crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls that now sheltered more people than they had in nearly a decade. He moved among the women awkwardly, like a man learning to walk again after years of stillness. They had taken refuge quickly, instinctively knowing what spaces were safest, how to tend to wounds with swift, practiced hands. One of them boiled water. Another tore cloth into strips, while a third coaxed soft moans from a girl no older than 16, cradling a baby that still hadn't cried. Tobias watched in silence, not out of fear, though he felt plenty, but out of awe. They were survivors. They moved with the grace of people who had lived through fire and carried the ashes in their bones. He recognized it because it lived in him too. Ayana stood by the fire, warming her trembling hands. Her face remained proud, but exhaustion carved deep lines beneath her eyes. Blood from the cut above her brow had dried, forming a dark streak across her temple. Her gaze followed the others, always alert, always measuring. Tobias approached her carefully, not wanting to intrude. "You said 3 days," he murmured. She nodded. 3 days without food, 2 without sleep. He hesitated, then gestured toward the pot simmering over the hearth. "It's not much, but it's hot." Ayana accepted the bowl of stew he handed her with a slight nod. "Thank you." They stood together for a long moment in the hush that followed. the storm sighing against the windows like a weary spirit. My wife used to say storms reminded her that the world had a soul. Tobias said quietly, mostly to himself. She said you had to listen close to hear what it was feeling. Ayanna didn't reply right away. Then she looked at him and asked, "And what do you think the storm is feeling tonight?" He met her eyes. Grief. And maybe hope. A flicker passed through her face, something like surprise. Something like understanding. "My daughter's name was Sarah," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Same as my wife. She was only 7 when." His voice caught. He looked away. Ayanna placed a hand on his arm. It was light, brief, but carried more comfort than anything he'd felt in years. "You don't have to tell me," she said gently. But Tobias wanted to. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the sound of the baby finally letting out a weak cry. Or the way Ayanna's people had filled the house with life. He needed to remember that pain didn't mean the end of love. Sometimes, it was the beginning of it. They came one night, he said, eyes distant, said they were tracking hostiles. Asked for food, shelter. I gave it to them. In the morning, my barn was burning. My wife and daughter. He couldn't finish. Ayanna didn't flinch. They said the same to us. Hostiles. Raiders. They came with fire and steel and said they were protecting the settlers. But we were just mothers and sisters. Just trying to live in peace. She turned to look at the others, who were now feeding the baby from a spoon Tobias had carved years ago. We buried our husbands with our hands. Dug graves with broken tools. Then we ran, not because we were afraid to die, but because someone had to live. Someone had to remember. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only resolve. I was afraid to live. Tobias said softly. For 8 years. I thought dying would have been easier. She looked back at him. And this time her gaze held something warmer than steel. And now? He paused. Then. Now I think easier isn't the same as right. Ayanna smiled. It wasn't wide or radiant. It was weary, edged with sorrow, but real. And in that moment, Tobias understood what had been missing in all his years of solitude. Not just love, but the hope of love. The knowledge that even in a world broken by cruelty, people still chose to care, still chose to believe in each other. I should get more wood for the fire, he said, suddenly needing to move. Ayanna stopped him with a quiet word. Wait. He turned. She gestured toward the window. The men who are hunting us, they're not just soldiers. They're men like Morrison. Men who do not see us as human. If they find us here, they won't just kill us. Tobias felt the familiar cold in his stomach. But it wasn't fear for himself anymore. Then we don't let them, he said. Ayanna studied him for a long moment. You would risk everything? For people you've only just met? He thought of Sarah's laughter. Of his daughter's drawings still pinned to the back wall. Of the years spent locked in grief and silence. And now, of a child in his home crying softly, clinging to life. For people I never should have turned away. He answered. Outside, the storm roared on. But inside, a flicker of warmth took hold in the heart of a man who had once closed his door to the world, and now found himself opening it again. Blank. Blank. The house was still. The kind of stillness that came after pain had spoken its piece and before fate had its say. Tobias Redmond stood by the fireplace, the flickering light casting shadows over his rugged face. Across from him, Ayanna stood as tall as ever, despite the wounds on her body and the weight on her heart. Between them hung a silence dense with revelation. "You are not helpless," Tobias had said moments ago. And Ayanna's reply had pierced deeper than any bullet. "We never were." That truth changed everything. The women who had entered his home as refugees had become warriors before his very eyes. Weapons appeared from beneath torn dresses. Movements sharpened, positions taken with purpose. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, now pulsed with the quiet readiness of a battleground. And somehow, amid the fear, something else bloomed: trust. They had chosen his home for a reason, not just because of its isolation, but because of the man who lived there. They had believed in his strength, even when he'd forgotten it himself. "You brought this fight here," Tobias said, not as an accusation, but a recognition. Ayanna met his gaze with steady calm. "We brought it to the place where we thought someone might still choose to stand." He should have been angry, but instead, he felt something stirring in his chest, a strange, aching pride. These women hadn't come to beg for protection. They had come to finish what had been started. And in doing so, they had reminded Tobias of the man he once was, before grief turned him into a ghost. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and distant voices rose above the storm. The riders were closing in. "How many men have you killed?" he asked. Ayanna didn't flinch. "Enough to know the cost. Enough to regret each one. But sometimes survival gives you no other choice." Tobias nodded. He understood, better than most. Ayanna stepped closer. "Captain Morrison will expect to find terrified women in a recluse who doesn't want trouble. But when he sees you fighting beside us, when he sees a white man choose our side, his men will hesitate. And hesitation is all we need." He looked into her eyes and saw not just the fire of vengeance, but the deeper flame of hope. A hope that the story didn't have to end in blood. That maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting on the other side of this night. The sounds of approaching horses grew louder. Tobias moved to the window, his hands steady as he loaded his rifle. "Let's make sure they learn what it means to underestimate the wrong people." Ayanna's smile was quiet, almost sad. "You're risking everything." He shrugged. "I lost everything once. Maybe it's time I risk something for someone else." The plan was simple and impossible. Ayanna and a few women would hold the house, drawing the attackers into a false sense of control. Tobias and the others would maneuver around the soldiers, striking from where they least expected. But it was more than strategy. It was a decision, to choose life, to protect those who had already lost too much. As Ayanna moved to her position, she paused by Tobias. "When this is over," she said softly, "you can't stay here, helping us. It means they'll come for you too." Tobias looked around the cabin. The walls he'd built to keep out the world now held its most sacred truths: courage, defiance, love. He wasn't afraid anymore. "I was already gone," he said. "Tonight, I remembered who I was. And who I still want to be." The front door crashed open. Captain Morrison stood in the doorway, rifle raised, mouth twisted in cruel confidence. But that confidence faltered when Tobias raised his own weapon. Before he could fire, The mirror flashed. Ayana's signal. In the storm-soaked dark. The trap was sprung. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning. The house became a fortress. The women fought like the memories of their families depended on it, because they did. Tobias moved like a man reborn. Each shot a promise that he would not lose another home without a fight. And when Morrison fell, Ayana's blade ending the chapter he'd written in blood, Tobias didn't feel victory. He felt relief, a breath, long held, finally released. But the night wasn't done. More riders came, reinforcements, another storm, this time made of men and steel. Tobias knew then that they couldn't simply survive, they had to change the story. They found another way, a more dangerous way. They saved a child. They risked everything for a stranger's baby because love demanded it. And in that choice, Tobias remembered something Sarah used to say: kindness is love with courage behind it. When dawn broke, it wasn't just the end of a night. It was the beginning of something new. The cabin, battered and broken, had become a place of rebirth. Ayana and her sisters would move on, north to safety, but they left with more than survival. They left knowing that someone had chosen them, that they had been seen not as enemies or fugitives, but as people worthy of protection. And Tobias Redmond, the man who had once closed his heart to the world, now opened it wide, not just to the women he'd fought beside, but to the idea that hope didn't die with loss. It grew back, slowly, bravely, in the hands we held, in the voices we listened to, in the doors we chose to open again. Blank. Blank. The silence after the storm was heavier than thunder. Tobias Redmond stood by his shattered front door, his rifle still warm in his hands. The body of Captain Morrison lay in the mud, eyes open in disbelief, the echo of Ayana's blade still lingering in the damp air. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like a warning. The baby had started to cry again, not the one from the women's arms, but a second cry, distant and haunting. Tobias froze. Ayana turned sharply toward the sound. "That's not ours," she said, her voice suddenly taut. Through the open door, the flickering light of torches danced in the distance. More riders, more soldiers, reinforcements. "We don't have much time," Tobias muttered. "If they find Morrison dead, they won't ask questions." Ayana finished. "They'll burn this place to the ground." Tobias glanced at the explosives in his hands. The dynamite he had unearthed from the back of the cupboard where it had been sleeping for 8 years. His original plan was simple: blow the dam and flood the valley. Drown them before they reached the house. But now, a baby's voice called out from somewhere below. A life too small, too fragile, caught in the current of someone else's war. "We can't do it," he said quietly. "You'd risk everything for a child you've never seen?" one of the Apache women whispered. "Yes," Tobias said without hesitation. "Because if we don't, who are we?" Ayana studied him, her dark eyes filled with something more than pain. Respect, understanding, hope. She gave the order to stand down. The explosives were returned to their hiding place. Instead of destruction, they chose strategy. The plan that followed was mad, bold. It required timing, silence, and complete trust between people who had known each other less than a day, but had already fought side by side for their lives. Ayanna and her group would create chaos at the front, drawing the attention of the reinforcements. Tobias, with the remaining women, would slip through the storm to find the baby and whoever had brought it into this battlefield. Rain softened the ground beneath their feet as they moved like shadows across the ranch. And there, nestled between two supply wagons, they found her, a woman in rough clothing, a laundress or camp cook, curled around a small bundle, whispering prayers into the baby's ear. Her name was Mary. The baby's name was Rose. They said it would be safe. She sobbed. They said it was just routine. Tobias gently helped her to her feet. It's not safe now, but we'll get you out. The women formed a protective ring around Mary and the child, and together they crept through the dark, bypassing guards and cutting through their own fear. For every step forward, Tobias felt the weight of his choices. At the cabin, Ayanna's team had drawn the soldiers in. Gunshots cracked the air, followed by silence. Too long, too final. Tobias feared the worst. But just as they reached the edge of the field, Ayanna's voice rang out. "We have Colonel Bradley's son." The storm, it seemed, stopped breathing. All movement outside ceased. Even the wind held its breath. Colonel Bradley, the true commander of this cruel campaign, had come to end what Morrison had started. But his son, caught sneaking through the back, had fallen into Ayanna's hands. A new tension gripped the air, and with it, a possibility. Bradley wanted his son alive. Tobias re-entered the house just as Ayanna pressed a blade to the young officer's throat. The boy trembled, wide-eyed, not with arrogance, but shame. Slowly, painfully, the truth had begun to dawn on him. "You were told we were raiders," Ayanna said quietly. "That we were savages. But we were just living. Just hoping." Bradley's voice bellowed from beyond the field. "Release my son and we'll give you safe passage." "No deals," Ayanna called back. "We want justice." But justice came in many forms. Tobias stepped forward. "There's another way." He turned to the boy. "You want to make this right? Speak the truth. Tell them what you saw. What Morrison did. Tell them what your father allowed." The boy hesitated. Then slowly, he nodded. A light flickered at the edge of the property. New riders, bearing different uniforms. Federal investigators. Someone had been watching. Someone had finally come. Hours later, as the sun climbed into the sky, Tobias stood in the doorway of what was once his fortress, and what had become his sanctuary. Ayanna and her people were preparing to leave, carrying the memories of their fallen and the strength of their survival. The baby, both babies, were safe. Mary would head east with protection. Ayanna's people would rebuild in the north. Tobias? He would go west. The man who had lived alone for 8 years was gone. In his place stood someone who had remembered what it meant to fight, to protect, to care. "I thought I was finished," he told Ayanna. "You were waiting," she replied. "Now you've begun." They didn't embrace, didn't cry, but something passed between them, an unspoken promise that this night would never be forgotten, that its pain would give birth to purpose. Tobias rode out at dawn, leaving behind a home built from wood, but carrying with him something far stronger: hope. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The sun was rising over the wounded hills, casting golden light across a land still heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Tobias Redmond stood beside the ruins of his cabin, the scorched wood and shattered windows whispering memories of a night no one would ever forget. Around him, the women who had turned his home into a battlefield were preparing to ride. Ayanna moved with the same grace she had shown in battle, calm, sure, and strong, but Tobias could see the tiredness in her eyes. 2 of her sisters had fallen, their bodies buried beneath a lone tree Tobias had once planted for shade. It now stood as a grave marker, simple but sacred. He approached her slowly, unsure what to say. Words felt small in the face of what they had survived. "You're leaving," he said quietly. "We must," Ayanna replied. "Our people are waiting. There's rebuilding to do. We need to bury our dead with our ancestors. And this place holds too many ghosts." Tobias looked around at what used to be his life. The fence he had mended endlessly. The porch he had spent lonely evenings on. The firewood stacked by the door for winters that had come and gone without purpose. It was all gone now. And in its place, something new had begun to grow. "You saved us," she said softly, interrupting his thoughts. "No." Tobias shook his head. "You saved me." They stood there for a moment. 2 souls changed by war. Connected by something deeper than survival. Not romance, not yet, but respect. Recognition. Hope. "I was dead," he admitted. "For 8 years. I breathed but didn't live. The day I buried my family. I thought I had buried myself with them." Ayanna's gaze softened. "Then maybe last night was your resurrection." He smiled. Faint but real. "Maybe it was." Ayanna turned to check on the others, her daughters. Sisters. Warriors. They moved with silent coordination. Gathering what little they had. Preparing to ride toward something uncertain. But this time, they were riding as the living, not the hunted. Tobias watched them with admiration. "You've got somewhere safe?" he asked. "North." She nodded. "Family in Montana Territory. Apache who escaped Morrison's wrath. They'll take us in." He glanced toward the path leading out of his ranch and into the unknown. "And you?" Ayanna asked. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I can't stay here. This place was a tomb. It held my grief and nothing else." She looked at him a long moment. Then offered a rare smile. "You said your wife used to tell you that kindness is what separates us from animals." He nodded. "Sarah believed that with her whole heart. You honored her," Ayanna said, "by choosing to open your door. By standing with us." Tobias didn't speak. The truth sat too deep in his chest to find words. One of the Apache women came over, leading a tired horse with an extra saddle. "For the cook," she said, "and the baby." Mary Hendricks, the young laundress who had been caught in Morrison's deception, was sitting nearby, cradling her infant. Her eyes were wide, exhausted, but thankful. "She needs to get to Denver," Ayanna said. "She has family there, but the trail's dangerous." Tobias understood immediately. "I'll take her," he said without hesitation. "Make sure she and the baby get there safe." Ayanna didn't respond right away, but her nod was slow and filled with meaning. "I hoped you'd say that." He turned toward Mary, who looked up at him with confusion and something close to relief. "I'll ride with you," he said. "The roads ahead are wild, but I know the land." Mary blinked back tears. "Thank you," as he helped her onto the horse. The baby stirred in her arms. letting out a tiny cry. Tobias reached out, gently touched the child's hand. "She's strong," he said. "So are you," Mary replied. The Apache women began to ride out, their formation tight and protective. Ayanna was the last to mount. She turned to Tobias once more. "You'll make a good guide," she said, "but maybe, one day, you'll let someone guide you too." He met her gaze. "If that day comes, I hope it's you." Their eyes held a promise neither spoke aloud. A promise that healing takes time. But it begins with choices made in love, in courage, in hope. Ayanna nodded once, then turned her horse north. Tobias turned west, with Mary and her baby at his side. He began a new kind of journey, not one driven by revenge or sorrow, but by purpose. The road to Denver would be long, dangerous, but for the first time in years, Tobias felt the fire of life burn in his chest again. A man who had once turned his back on the world now moved toward it. A man who had locked himself away from pain now chose to walk through it for others. And somewhere in the distance, in a cabin by a ruined fence, the wind whispered through the empty windows like a benediction. He chose love. He chose hope. He chose life. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The early morning air carried a rare softness, a stillness untouched by gunpowder or sorrow. Tobias Redmond adjusted the saddle on his horse and looked over his shoulder one last time. Behind him stood the skeletal remains of his cabin, now quiet after a night of fire, storm, and blood. A place that had once been his sanctuary, his prison, was now only a shadow. But even ruins can mark the beginning of something sacred. Ahead of him rode Mary Hendricks, cradling her daughter close to her chest, both wrapped in borrowed blankets from the Apache. Their horse moved slowly, wearily, but with determination. Like its riders, it had survived the impossible. The trail to Denver stretched before them like a promise wrapped in danger. 500 miles of open country, outlaw hideouts, treacherous rivers, and the ever-present threat of soldiers who had not yet heard about Morrison's fall or Colonel Bradley's disgrace. But Tobias had never felt more ready. Each step of the horse beneath him was a heartbeat of redemption. "Did you ever ride with a child before?" Mary asked softly after a few miles, her voice cutting through the hush of the waking world. "No," Tobias admitted, "but I reckon this is the best first time I could ask for." She smiled faintly, a fragile thing full of quiet strength. "She hasn't cried once since we left. She knows she's safe." They rode in silence for a while, the landscape slowly unfurling before them, endless hills turning into golden plains. Rivers swollen from the storm they had narrowly escaped. Everything felt cleaner in the morning light, as if the world had been washed of some of its pain overnight. Mary glanced sideways at Tobias. "Why are you helping us?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because I forgot what it felt like to help someone. And when I remembered, I didn't want to forget again." She nodded, her eyes glassy but clear. "I used to think the world was cruel. And then someone kind stepped into it." Tobias didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night, they camped beneath a cluster of old junipers. Tobias built a small fire and laid out blankets while Mary nursed her child nearby. The baby reached out once, her tiny fingers brushing Tobias's weathered hand as if blessing the calluses life had carved into his skin. In that moment, he felt something unexpected, hope, not the kind that comes easily or brightly, but the kind that survives storms and shrapnel, the kind that lingers even when all seems lost. As the firelight danced on their faces, Mary spoke again. "She's all I have," she said. "Her name is Rose. It suits her," Tobias said gently. "She bloomed in the darkest night." Mary smiled, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead. "So did you." Tobias felt something stir in his chest, an ache. Not of pain, but of healing. Love wasn't just romance. Sometimes it was choosing to carry someone's burden, to walk beside them into the unknown because they shouldn't have to do it alone. That was what this ride was about. Not escape, but arrival. At dawn, they continued, riding along creeks and through whispering valleys. Occasionally, Tobias would teach Mary how to spot danger, how to read animal tracks, how to hide signs of their passing. She listened, learned. She was brave, far braver than she believed. They shared stories on the trail. Tobias told her of Sarah, of the life he had lost and the guilt that had built his walls. Mary spoke of her time as a cook, of dreams postponed and choices made from fear rather than freedom. "You gave me a second chance," she said on their fourth day. "You didn't have to. You reminded me I had one left to give." As the days passed, they became something close to family, not by blood, but by bond, the kind of connection forged under pressure, between people who had witnessed too much and still chose to believe in something better. One night, after traveling through a rain-slicked canyon, they came upon a meadow filled with fireflies. Rose, now more alert, reached out in wonder. Tobias laughed softly, genuinely, the sound strange in his throat after so many silent years. "I forgot how beautiful this land is," he murmured. "You're seeing it new," Mary said. "Yes," he nodded. "Through her eyes. Through yours." By the time Denver's outer lights came into view, twinkling across the flatlands like stars that had landed on Earth, Tobias felt something unfamiliar settle over him. Peace. They arrived at the doorstep of Mary's sister by sunset. The woman, older, kind-eyed, pulled them both into her arms before taking Rose and cradling her like salvation. "You saved them," she whispered to Tobias. "No," he replied. "They saved me." Mary turned to him, tears in her eyes. "Will you stay?" Tobias looked out at the open plains, then back at her. He saw her strength, her hope, her love. He saw Rose's bright eyes watching him as if waiting for an answer. "I can't stay," he said gently. "Not yet, but I'll return, if you'll let me." Mary nodded slowly. "We'll be waiting." He rode out the next morning, alone again, but no longer lonely. Because somewhere behind him was a woman and child he had helped lead into the light. And ahead of him, maybe more souls who needed guiding. Tobias Redmond had once buried his heart beside a grave. Now, he carried it west, whole again. Blank. Blank. Tobias Redmond rode back toward the capital not as a fugitive or a man seeking revenge, but as a witness, a protector, and a guide for the truth. At his side rode Lieutenant James Bradley, son of a disgraced colonel, whose testimony could unravel years of systemic abuse. Behind them, in the care of federal marshals, The Apache women traveled under federal protection. A community of survivors no longer in hiding. The air was different on this trail. Not heavy with dread, but charged with purpose. Tobias glanced at James, who rode in silence, his face pale but resolved. The boy had shed the illusions of military glory. He now carried the weight of truth, and with it, the potential for healing. "You sure about this?" Tobias asked gently. James nodded. "They deserve justice. My father, he taught me loyalty. But he never taught me what to do when loyalty meant silence." Tobias studied him for a moment. Then said, "You're teaching yourself now. That's more than most men ever manage." They stopped by a stream that evening, letting the horses drink while the last light of day slipped behind the horizon. James sat by the water's edge, tossing stones without aim. Tobias joined him, staring at the reflection of stars on the dark surface. "I grew up believing we were the heroes," James said, his voice brittle. "That soldiers protected the weak, stood for honor. But now I know we were the wolves some people feared." Tobias laid a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "You saw the truth, and you didn't run from it. That matters. I still feel like I'm betraying something." "You're not betraying your country," Tobias said. "You're helping it heal." That night, sleep came fitfully. The next morning, they crossed the final ridge into the territorial capital. News had already traveled. The scandal had reached the ears of judges, politicians, and reporters. Morrison's name was being spoken with disgust, Bradley's with disbelief. As Tobias and James approached the federal courthouse, they were met by U.S. Marshals. Tobias dismounted, helped James down, and gave a slight nod to the officer leading them. "This is the one?" the marshal asked. Tobias nodded. "He's ready." Inside the courtroom, tension hung thick in the air. The surviving Apache women sat quietly, dignified, their presence alone demanding attention. Ayanna sat among them, her face calm, her eyes fierce. James took the stand. His hands trembled as he took the oath, but his voice steadied with each word. He told everything about the false reports, the hidden raids, Morrison's brutality, his father's knowledge, the cover-ups, the silence expected of them all. And then, he spoke of Ayanna, of the night she had spared him, of the strength she and her sisters had shown, of the baby crying in the storm, of Tobias, who had stood against an army not with hatred, but with conviction. The courtroom was silent when he finished. Ayanna stood slowly and approached. With the judge's permission, she addressed the room. "We are not victims," she said clearly. "We are survivors. We did not fight to destroy. We fought to live, to protect the last of what was ours. If this young man had died that night, we would have become the monsters they said we were. But he lived, and he speaks the truth. That truth must matter more than vengeance." It was the kind of moment that reshapes a nation. Outside, the sun rose higher. Reporters hurried to file stories. Lawmakers whispered of investigations, and the seeds of real change began to take root. Later, Tobias found Ayanna standing beneath a tree in the courthouse garden. "You were incredible in there," he said. She turned to him, tired but radiant. "It wasn't just my voice. It was all of us." He nodded. "What now?" "We go north. Try to build again." "I'm headed west," Tobias said, "to start over." Maybe help others do the same. They stood in silence, the weight of a shared journey settling between them. Ayanna finally spoke. When I first knocked on your door, I didn't think you would open it. I almost didn't, he confessed. But I heard something in your voice. Something that reminded me why I used to believe in people. Ayanna stepped closer. And now? Now I believe again. She reached out, touched his hand. Then our pain wasn't wasted. He held her gaze, the strength in her eyes anchoring him like roots in dry earth. No, he said, it gave us this. A chance to do better. To love better. To live. They parted with promises, not of forever, but of someday, of paths crossing again, of hearts that would remember. And as Tobias mounted his horse and turned westward once more, he felt not loss, but hope. Hope that the truth, once spoken, would ripple across time. Hope that justice, once awakened, would never sleep again. And love, not the easy kind, but the enduring kind, had taken root in broken ground and begun to bloom. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The sun rose over the Redmont Ranch like a golden benediction, casting soft light on broken fences, burnt earth, and blood-stained porches. But in that morning glow, something else emerged, something quieter than triumph, but far more lasting, healing. Tobias Redmont stood at the edge of what had once been his sanctuary. The house was half splintered, the barn door hanging by a hinge. Smoke still lingered in the air, but where others might see only ruin, Tobias saw something deeper, a place that had fulfilled its purpose. It had saved lives. Behind him, Ayanna and the remaining Apache women readied their horses. Their faces were solemn but not defeated. The night had cost them dearly, sisters, friends, blood, but they were alive. And with life came possibility. Tobias watched as Mary Hendricks secured her baby to her chest, adjusting the blanket one last time before preparing to ride. The child had survived both storm and battle. Now, she was the seed of something new. Are you ready? Ayanna asked, approaching him. He turned to her. Her face was still streaked with dried blood and ash, but in her eyes bloomed the gentlest fire, resilience forged not from rage but from love. Love for her people, love for justice. No one's ever ready for goodbye, Tobias said, his voice rough with emotion. We're not saying goodbye, Ayanna replied, only, until next time. He nodded. There were no words strong enough to capture what they had shared. Only the understanding that comes between people who have faced death together and chosen life. Ayanna reached into her satchel and handed Tobias something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly to reveal a necklace, simple, woven with black horsehair and small turquoise stones. It belonged to my sister. She said, she would want you to have it. Tobias clutched it in his hand, overcome by a wave of emotion. I don't deserve this. You earned it, Ayanna replied softly, for opening your door, for opening your heart again. He looked at her, at the strength carved into her bones, and said, I'll never forget you. You better not. She smiled, or I'll come find you. They shared a final embrace, wordless and profound, and then Ayanna mounted her horse and turned north. One by one, the women followed, disappearing into the distance like wind moving through tall grass. Mary lingered last, holding her baby close. She looked at Tobias, eyes glistening. "You sure you won't come with us?" she asked. Tobias smiled gently. "Not yet. There's still work to be done here. But one day. Maybe." Mary reached out and touched his arm. "You saved us." "No," he said. "You gave me a reason to live again." She turned, then rode after the others, her figure growing smaller with every heartbeat. Tobias stood alone, but not empty. He looked around his broken ranch and saw not the end of a life, but the beginning of another. 8 years he had spent buried in grief, isolating himself from the world that had hurt him. And now, that same world had knocked on his door, bleeding and desperate, and he had chosen to answer. In doing so, he'd rediscovered not just his strength, but his purpose. Days passed. Tobias repaired what he could, buried the dead with honor, and carved markers for each soul lost to Morrison's brutality. He planted wildflowers around the graves, red ones for courage, white for peace, and blue for memory. He thought often of Sarah and their daughter. He no longer spoke to their ghosts with bitterness, but with gratitude. Their love had taught him how to be kind. Their loss had shown him how to value life. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Denver. Mary and her child had made it safely. Her sister had welcomed them with open arms. The baby, Rose, was growing stronger every day. Mary wrote of a small home, a warm hearth, and dreams she never thought she'd be allowed to dream again. She ended the letter with a single line: "If ever you ride this way, there will always be a place for you." Tobias folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside his coat, and smiled. Yes, he would ride that way someday. Not today. Today, he mounted his horse and turned west, toward new land, new people, new roads that might lead to other doors in need of opening. He no longer needed to hide. His pain had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something useful, into something hopeful. Love hadn't died with Sarah. It had simply taken on a new shape. As the wind picked up, carrying dust across the plains, Tobias rode forward, not to escape his past, but to honor it, because in the end, love was not about what was lost. It was about what you chose to protect next.